I'm Todd Hopkins with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, talking to you from Vero Beach, Florida this morning. Today and tomorrow, we are bringing together a number of partners from across the science and stewardship continuum to identify and prioritize needs and gaps around sea level rise in the northern Gulf of Mexico. We have a workshop set up for today and tomorrow, and our goals and outcomes from this workshop are, like I said, update needs and gaps, prioritize gaps and needs, and most importantly, create a 21 to 23 work plan to work on those and fill those gaps and needs. And then there'll be a workshop report, of course, coming out. So I want to introduce Renee Colini. Renee.
Hi, everybody. Y'all been hearing a lot from me lately. I'll be your, I guess, event director for the whole 2 days.
All right. Everybody should have gotten a folder in the email in the mail with a bunch of materials and things in it. I have mine right here, and business cards, sheets, and things like that, worksheets. Those are also available online. And if someone would be kind enough to put that link in the chat, they've sent it out a few times, but let's make it convenient. You can get to all those materials online if you want to work online on your computer. We'd like to have everybody keep their cameras on during the dialogue and the questions and answers. If you have connection issues and need to be offline or need to shut off your video because of your feed strength, that's fine. We will be doing an exercise a little bit later, and we're going to need you, if you don't have video, to be able to signal yes or no, a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's kind of a question and answer icebreaker, just so we get to know who's in the group and where you all are from. So we have a number of facilitators today working with us. We have Marion. Why don't you go ahead and turn your cameras on when I mention your name, and that way people can see who you are.
And actually, Todd, I have a slide to introduce them here in a minute.
Oh, well, all right.
Yeah.
Off you go.
Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and jump in with the facilitators. Thank you very much, Todd, for getting us started. As Todd just said, we've got a lot of goals and objectives today. Just as a refresher, we also want to make sure, we talked about our goals from Todd, but what the objectives for the today are to get those goals accomplished are understanding what place is, increasing awareness of the resources and things we have right now that can help us address sea level rise resilience, identify and prioritize gaps and needs around sea level rise resilience, figure out what specific activities we can do to move those gaps forward, and then build collaborations and networks. That's always a big part of us coming together. So as Todd said, we want you to keep the cameras on if possible, but we have a few other best practices. Please turn away from distractions for the duration of the meeting. I know we're asking for a lot of your time, but we're going to dig in here and really make sure that we are moving place forward and we're moving sea level rise resilience forward. And so we need people to be focused on what we're doing while you're here, but also be flexible. We understand that people have other things going on. We're working from home. And also, if you get disconnected, just try and reconnect and stay patient. Like I said earlier, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Do please remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking. We're expecting somewhere between 45 and 55 people today. So it's going to be important that we stay muted so we're not having background noise or talking over each other. As Todd said, please use the chat window or raise your hand feature to ask a question or make a comment. And then we also have the ability to do ELMO, which stands for enough, let's move on. So if you feel like we're getting stuck in a topic, so there's going to be a lot of discussion here and we're going to be trying to figure things out. But if you feel like we're just sort of circling, you can say, okay, I call ELMO, enough, let's move on. But we also have a marina that will be running the whole time we're here so that we're able to put things, if you've ever heard of like a parking lot, we'll put that concept into the marina. So it's parked for now, but if we have time to revisit it later, we'll be able to come back to it. And then the biggest best practice for us is participation. It's really not fun speaking into the void. That's part of why we'd like your cameras on, but also we need feedback from y'all. You see here, these little robots are building together. Today and tomorrow, your participation are puzzle pieces in building this network and making sure that we're all able to move forward together. So please make sure that you're participating. Just to give you some tips and tricks on how to do that, your mute is down here on the bottom left. The chat box, you just click chat and type your information in. And for those reactions, like Todd mentioned, in terms of like thumbs up or a smiley face, those are temporary, but you can also raise your hand right here. And that is more, it'll stay up until you put it back down. So that was the raise hand feature that he was talking about. All right, so before I get into materials and telling you a little bit more about place, Todd, is there anything else you wanted to say before we take off?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So our materials that you got, like Todd said, everybody should have gotten a folder. And for those of you who weren't able to get the folder, in the chat, there's a link to those digital materials like Todd said. And so first I'm going to talk you through what we have on the right side. I only show you in my folder, it's kind of messy. So there's an agenda. This will help you follow on through the day in terms of all the things we're trying to accomplish. We'll go through this in a little more detail. Then we have the state of place behind that. We do this for each of our workshops every year. And this tells you a little bit about what's been going on. There's so much to cover. And so this way, the things we don't talk about, or to give you a little more detail about the things we do, you can see what other people in the network are working on and what kind of efforts are working towards sea level rise resilience in the region. We also have our gaps and needs. This is sort of the star of the show, if you will. There's 3 pages and they're numbered 1, 2, 3. We're going to keep referring to this throughout the days. So make sure you have this handy. Oh, and I will say before I go on to the next thing, if you do not have a print version of this, there's a PDF version. I highly recommend you go ahead and download it out of those digital materials because you are going to need to make some marks and stuff on it. And then we did try and send each of you your own 2-pager. This tells you a little bit about sea level rise that's expected locally to your area, including projections for the region and a little bit about high tide flooding and also things you can do to start planning for that. Okay, on the left side, very important always, do not forget to fill out your evaluation. I would recommend waiting till the end so you know what you're going to say. But this is really important for us to make sure that as we move forward in this partnership, particularly as the place is starting to reframe and shape itself from being the cooperative, that we're moving forward productively. We can't do that without hearing from you about how we engage. And then there's resources. There's also cards, like Todd said, and some RAT cards and some advisory things, advertisements, but the big thing is the resources. And so there's 5 different colors. The first are resources on communication. You'll see them in pink, and on your agenda, the pink, where you try and keep it all color coded, keep it together. Then there's resources that are on high tide flooding and storm surge. So high tide flooding is this blue color, and then surge is this teal color. You'll find both of those in there. We're going to group those together today when we explore them. We also have resources for understanding habitat vulnerability. Those will be the green ones. And then resources for understanding social vulnerability to make sure that we are thinking about the whole aspect of our communities and our ecosystems. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. So we're going to have an icebreaker here in a minute. I didn't think anyone would appreciate, 40 minutes of everyone saying their name and where they're from. So we're going to break out into small groups and try a more fun way, both to wake us up and get comfortable speaking and using our cameras and our tools, but also so that way we are able to get to know each other a little bit and start forming some of those connections. I'm going to do a brief introduction to Place SLR. We are new, but we're not new. So explaining what that means and bringing it all together. So we're going to spend some time, again, exploring these resources. These are things that are available. So we know, again, when we go to talk about gaps and needs, what already exists and what may not exist. When we're looking at those, it helps trigger things we're missing. Then we get to take a break. We will hold true to this and promise to get you to your break on time, give you your full 10 minutes. Then we'll do a quick reflection. Let's look back. What was missing? What did we really enjoy? What was new? And also thinking about how you might apply it, right? Tools, I think, have a tendency to sound fun, but if we don't think about them in the context in which they can be used, it makes it difficult to really see what they could relate to. And then we're going to go over some case studies. So we're going to hear from Carolyn Martin, Cynthia Cannon, and Chase Lisson, all who have been tackling sea level rise resilience, and they're all at different phases of this process, and they're also tackling different issues around sea level rise resilience. And then finally, there's a thing covering that. Well, what that says there, so we're going to go over gaps and needs. That'll be the first time we review them briefly. And then we'll go over what we're going to do tomorrow, and we'll adjourn to get a good night's sleep, get some things done for the rest of our workday, and come back tomorrow nice and fresh. When we come back, we'll recap day one because we all will have slept since then. We're going to do, I call it an icebreaker, but what it really is a warm up. It's a way to get us starting to talk and think about things that we're missing and things we'd like to have. Then we're not only going to review those gaps and needs in a little more detail together and discuss them, identify what's missing, what are things we should be adding to this list, is there anything we can check off, and then also prioritize those. We'll take a break, get some more coffee, refuel, and then we'll come back and identify for those top 3 gaps and needs, what should we be working towards? What should the staff of place be working towards, and what should the network itself be doing? Then we'll take just a quick minute to talk about how we communicate moving forward. We've got the things we've been doing, but we like to just check in and make sure people are hearing us, that they're getting the information, that we don't need to be reaching out in a different way. And then we're also going to have a conversation about proactive policies and sort of other catalyst conversations. And so last year, this came up to make some time this year. I say last year, in 2019, we took a break last year. In 2019, we heard that there's a need for having more proactive policies in place, and how sometimes it feels like sea level rise resilience can't move forward because we're kind of on our heels. We're also starting to hear some things around maybe there's impediments to actually implementing some of these efforts. And so this is a space to start to characterize and understand the big picture of these challenges, not a gap or a need that we can explicitly address, but if this group of people working on sea level rise resilience don't start to characterize the big picture and that sort of those wicked issues, no one's going to be able to move forward on it, right? If we're focused on sea level rise resilience and we're not talking about it, who will be? So we're going to spend some time talking about that and what we may be able to do. And then finally, we'll wrap up, reflect a little bit, and then adjourn. So here are the facilitators Todd mentioned. I was kind of impressed to see him list them all out himself. I know I couldn't have done that. We're going to go into small groups, so you'll be with one of these people. But a big hand right off the gate for all these people being here and helping out. This definitely would not have been able to come together without them. And so something we added last minute, one of the things that we really like about in-person meetings is we get to share, right? We talk about things other than just resilience or other than just sea level rise science. And part of that is sharing the things that are good in our lives and building those connections. And given the past 20 months, I think it's really important that even though we have to meet virtually, we're not losing those good things that we like to share. So Carrie's going to drop it in the chat, but there is a wall we have, and I'm going to go ahead and pull it up really fast so you can see it. It's a Padlet. We don't have a specific time set for us to work on these. It's just going to be there for the 2 days. You know, usually it's a coffee card or something you would share with somebody about things that are making you happy. And I think it's important that we do this here. So if you think of something that makes you happy or something that's given you a smile that's coming up or happened in the past, you can go ahead and add. I put a few here already. My dog makes me smile big time, so he's been keeping me happy. And then also my niece got her first visit from the tooth fairy. So the way you do this is you just hit a plus sign there. This will pop up. You can write what you'd like to say here. You can download a picture. If you have one already in your Google account, you can use that button, or you can just write something. But so please take a minute throughout the next 2 days. And if you don't have anything to write, it's at least a nice place to go and look and think about something happy that's happening. All right, so now on to the icebreakers. Sonia has got us all divided up. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right into those. And just so you know, the goal of this, your facilitators will explain it, but this is just a fun way for us to get to know each other. So we'll see you in the room.
Let me see if I got my camera.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much. I hope it was fun. You got to know a lot of people So do any of the facilitators have anything fun or funny they'd like to share? Anything bring lots of hilarity to your groups?
Not a lot of catfish fans in group 5. They like catfish, but they like shrimp better.
So if fisheries, if you guys and marine.
Yeah, no catfish fans in our group either. No, but I'll share, other than my husband bombing in my office, is my group is excited to learn about the new iteration of the cooperative turning into place, maybe some geographic expansion or lessons learned, or ways to translate what's generated from our area into the larger geographies.
Nice. Yeah, my group also not huge catfish fans, but they also all knew each other already. So that was really fun. And so we got to explore a little bit about how everybody else's life has been going, more of that happy wall. Anybody else something funny or fun or exciting to share?
No catfish fans in my group either. We had a pretty diverse group across federal government, state, nonprofits, and also local government. And we had a recommendation for sweet and sour Twizzlers.
Ooh, nice. That'll be
I'm starting to
up next time we're in person.
Well, I'm starting to wonder why we even posed the catfish question, because we also did not like catfish. But we also ended up going off script, and apparently I am the only person in group 2 who was not a dog person. So that was fun.
She's just outing herself in front of all of us, but she's not a dog.
I have a dog. I like dogs, but I just,
I think this is my fault as the person who made this icebreaker, because I prefer catfish over shrimp, and I will happily wave that flag.
Well, now that she's been outed as the only one in a group of 40 plus who likes catfish.
Not true. We had a catfish lover in my group as well. Very enthusiastic fried catfish with a side of coleslaw. That's the way to go.
Hear it.
Nice. You found a kindred spirit, Carrie. That's the person you'd have to meet up with at the coffee pot later if there was one.
Yeah, Renee, I think next time it's what's your favorite side? Coleslaw. I heard coleslaw. I like collard greens. Maybe somebody wants some fried okra.
I think Kim's got your back on that. All right, well, we're going to keep moving. And like Jenna said, we're actually going to talk a little bit now about Place SLR, what it is, where it came from. Some of you may have heard this already, but we want to make sure moving forward that we're all in the same place on this and that we're all moving together in lockstep. So how did we even get to today? So some of y'all may remember in fall 2014, we began the Sentinel Site Cooperative Pilot Program. There was a lot of effort that led up to that before that, even a workshop in 2012, but things really got going in 2014. And so as we started this pilot program, the goal was to bring together resources and all the disparate things that people were working around sea level rise on and help that move forward productively. In 2018, there was an evaluation of the program itself. So in addition to the Northern Gulf Sentinel Site Cooperative, there were 4 others that were also taking the same kind of approach in a place-based way, bringing together all the resources that were available on sea level rise resilience to make progress. The results came back really positive. There was a lot of good things that came from this, lots of support for people, but there were some challenges with the funding mechanism. Previously, a bunch of different offices in NOAA had contributed funds, and so there were some problems with leadership change and some of those sort of technical pieces. So Sea Grant formally adopted the Sentinel Site Cooperative Program and agreed to provide funding for a few years so that a new program could be stood up, and each one of the 5 cooperatives is moving forward with that in a little bit different way to meet the needs locally and to make sure that we are meeting needs the best way we can, while also kind of dealing with some of those challenges we identified in the evaluation, which led to Place. So we aligned ourselves with Sea Grant. Oh, please make sure you're on mute if you're not. So we aligned ourselves with Sea Grant's priorities, but at the same time made sure that based on the things we heard in the evaluation and through all of the consistent conversations and feedback we have with our partners and stakeholders on the ground, that we were not losing any of the good pieces of what the cooperative had been. So we're going to move forward stronger and more productively as Place. And so I just want to take a quick second on why sea level rise. For one thing, it's a very pressing problem. We know it's becoming increasingly more important, but also there are a lot of resources out there about it, but they do feel disconnected. And so that's what this random assortment of shapes and bits and pieces kind of are. You know, you can think about this as being some research, maybe over here is the sea level rise viewer, and this could be some funding opportunities, and maybe over here is some technical capacity, but they weren't really coming together well. And part of that is because sea level rise covers so many different things, and partly because we're advancing on how to be resilient to sea level rise very quickly. So the goal of Place, and formerly the cooperative, was to bring together these disparate pieces in a place where we're working on them, bringing together the people trying to use the information, the people generating the information, the people that operate at the in-between, so that there's a productive way to move forward on sea level rise resilience. So for those of you who remember the cooperative, the mission was around integration, translation, and transition of the information and products that existed so that it can be applied by people who are on the ground working on this information to be more resilient to sea level rise and flooding. The mission of Place is very similar. You can see here, I had to break it down, the mission for Place is a little longer, but we're still focusing on enhancing resilience to coastal inundation under rising sea levels. We're still focusing on this idea of increasing access and application of sea level rise science, but we've added this information around stimulating dialogue and really facilitating resilience and mitigation actions, really making sure we're going all the way to that end there. And then we've specified in the mission, where we didn't before, that we're doing this by working directly with stakeholders across the ground, people across the Gulf, people who are on the ground working on this, whether it's a natural resource manager, utility authority, a coastal planner, a floodplain manager. This covers a wide range of things. So making sure that it's clear that's who we're working with to help shape the scope and the forward motion of Place. And our purpose is sort of a restatement of the mission, but we kind of get a little bit into making sure that we're clear that when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about things being exacerbated by sea level rise. And so this includes surge from hurricanes, nuisance flooding, erosion, habitat degradation, saltwater intrusion, stormwater flooding. And this is not a limited list. Obviously, there's more things, but this helps to clarify within our purpose that talking about sea level rise doesn't just mean we're talking about mean sea level. We're talking about all the things that are exacerbated by that. And we specify in our purpose too, that this is not just an environmental problem or a built environment problem, but that we're working across and intersecting both. So I heard geography mentioned from Jenna. So this is the current defined geography in the blue hatching, the coastal counties that cover this range. And now we picked this range because there's a similarity in landscape, both in the environmental landscape, but also in the built landscape, right? There's not huge metropolitan areas. There's a lot of rural area there, and there's some major ports and just sort of similar demographics across the region. And again, we expect the amount of sea level rise and the impact from them to be similar. That doesn't mean, though, that we don't work outside of this region. Todd Hopkins, who introduced us today and got us kicked off, is over in Vero Beach. We also have several projects like Gulf Tree and others that are Gulf-wide. Obe, who's down in South Florida, I've worked with many times on generating products and things to help share information that can be translated not just for the Gulf, not just for the whole state of Florida, but also for the whole US. So this is our focus area, but we are always happy to work with people in other parts of the country and to make sure that, and especially other parts of the Gulf, to make sure that our information is getting integrated and shared where it makes sense. So a little bit more about those focus areas and goals I mentioned from Sea Grants. One of them is the healthy coastal ecosystems. You know, they are protected, enhanced, and restored. We want to make sure that we're doing that with good science and tools. We also want to make sure that we are focusing on resilient communities and economies, that how things are going to change and being ahead of those changes is being integrated into community resilience. And none of this happens without environmental literacy and workforce development. This is really key. We don't want to forget this very important aspect of making sure that not only the citizens in our communities and that are stewards of our environment understand what's happening, but also helping to build workforce capacity and literacy moving forward. So it sounds nice. How do we actually do that as a group? How do we on this call help make that move forward? So our approach is to take on sort of a straightforward, if you will, approach. We get together. This is what we're doing right now. This is a picture from 2019. We identify gaps and needs. We're going to do that tomorrow morning. We're going to look at what we know already is missing and identify what else can be added. We're going to go through and prioritize. It hurts my facilitator heart greatly that we don't have sticky dots to use, but we came up with the next best alternative to sticky dots. So we'll be going through and prioritizing as a group. Collectively, we're going to decide what should we be focusing, what's most urgent in the next 2 years. And then together we'll identify what activities need to happen under those different priorities. How can we move forward? What makes sense both from the difficult things, but also some of the easy things. And then we're going to do that every 2 years, but on the off years, we're still going to get together. We're still going to talk about our progress. We're going to share and network and collaborate. We used to meet every year to do the prioritization, and we realized that we were still working on things 2 years later. So we've shifted a little bit. But in those in-between years, we're still going to get together, and those workshops will look a little differently. There'll be more network building and more sharing of progress across the whole network. And so who is in the network? What makes up the network? So first, there are the stakeholders. Many of those are y'all on the phone. I think many of you on the phone also fall into other categories, but we have the built and natural environment stewards. We also have people who focus on translation, and we also have people who help support sea level rise action. So all of them fall into this category here. We also have the advisory committee. Many of y'all were asked to serve in that capacity. Coming here is one of your responsibilities. And then it represents a wide subset of the many stakeholders across the Northern Gulf. We also have an implementation committee. Many of those faces you saw on the facilitator page are our implementation committee. It's a smaller group that really focuses on facilitating action and helping to integrate the outputs and outcomes from place efforts across the network into their own networks, into their own organizations, into their own existing networks. Not saying that word. And then there's our collaborators, right? So we have stakeholders, but there are other types of collaborators: researchers, people who provide technical support, people who have specific capacity to engage stakeholders that maybe aren't at the table that should be. So people that we collaborate with to help expand the reach of the network and also to better support other members of the network. We also have our management team. This is an important component. They consist of representatives from Sea Grant, and they are integral to both funding to make sure that continues to happen and to make sure that our reporting is aligning with that, again, helping to make the money continue to flow. And then we also have our staff. The staff help to implement the activities and address those gaps more specifically, help provide momentum and move things forward. There is a dedicated coastal climate resilience specialist, that's me, but we also have other members of the staff as needed that come on board as we get funding to take on bigger projects. Right now, this is the 5 of us. Again, you've already seen some of our faces, but I've added here sort of our different roles. You see we have someone focused on education that's working on that workforce literacy. We've got Michaela Hemming, who makes a whole bunch of resilience projects move forward. We've got Carrie Schaefer, who is just a wonderful catch-all for getting everything done. She's leaving us at the end of this month, but we are so glad that we've had her for the past year. And then Sarah Martin, who is all things wetlands and sea level rise, which is a very critical issue in the Northern Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot of some of the projects and efforts, things that are winding down, but that have great outputs from them. One is the Resilience to Future Flooding project. There are videos on how to communicate about sea level rise, and you'll see more of those in the resources section, but also small grants that have had some great outcomes and outputs, which you'll see videos from those on the break. We have our Sea Level Rise in the Classroom. This is focused on high school students. And you can see there the 4 modules. It's really focused on how do we take proactive action. And this is just rolled out actually in the past week or 2. And we already have had from teachers on Facebook and other places reaching out that are just thrilled about this and ready for it to come to their own states. And then there's this project called INGOM plus N2E2, which is not the best acronym, but it represents a project that's bringing together understanding how the economic impacts of sea level rise and storm surge in particular, understanding how we can better manage our barrier islands. We're expanding marsh modeling efforts, and also putting them all together to see how they work together. And as we add natural and nature-based features, how does that mitigate those actions that we were looking at? Projects that we're going to maintain that hopefully all of you have heard about. One is the maintenance of resources. So Gulftree, which is a tool for tools, if you will, is still out there. It's still being updated. That's one of the things Michaela does. We also have a set inventory, so surface elevation tables that just got updated by Mike Osland and Sarah Martin. Sarah really had to do the legwork to get people to answer, but we got lots of great things updated there. And now it actually shows trends of how the marshes are keeping up with sea level rise or not. And then there's also localslr.org, a tool that lets you find out what your local sea level rise scenarios are. And as new scenarios come out, that'll be updated. We're working right now on comparing marsh models to better understand their capacity by looking back when we model them to see how well they predicted what actually did happen. And then from that, try to understand which models it makes sense to use when. When is it worth paying for one versus when does one that already exists going to be good enough? And then the big thing is we've got trainings and technical support. Here's just a summary from our Lunch and Learns, and you can see here, this was just a sea level rise lunch and learn for consultants and environmental engineers. Good use of time, and even 6 months later, people had actually applied and used those tools, so that was great. Another type of technical support we provide is helping, and I'm going to get into this method a little more in depth, but helping communities figure out the best strategy for them for adapting to sea level rise. So this is an adaptation pathway, which sort of navigates through the amount of sea level rise and what adaptation strategy you might want to use based on observed amounts of rise. And so we're helping a town right now apply this method there. And then yet another example is that we've been helping with cost benefit analyses here in the Northern Gulf to understand the dollar return for specific adaptation strategies. We've all heard the $4 to $6 saved for mitigation money spent now, but one of the things we heard at our last partnership workshop is people wanted us to put real numbers to that on actions happening locally. So we've been working on that. And new things that are coming up that all of y'all could get in on the ground floor with, if you will. One is the environmental literacy program that we're starting that combines in sort of a three-legged stool, if you will, approach to enhance sea level rise resilience. Is first, we're taking that sea level rise in the classroom to the whole state of Florida, also Louisiana and Texas. So we're excited to be taking that project. We're going to localize it, get state standards, make sure the examples are relevant. Simultaneously, we're going to be doing community connection dialogues where we are going to connect municipal staff, people who are on the ground working, with engaged and informed residents who want to help, but maybe don't know how to direct that energy. So we'll give those residents some training, help them understand what sea level rise resilience looks like, connect them with those staffers from different municipalities at the county and city level. And then together they can move forward on tackling the next thing on the list. And then finally, we have pop-ins. So there's a whole section of the populace that just doesn't really realize it's the problem or isn't aware of sea level rise resilience being an issue in the Gulf. And so we're going to take the activities from the classroom and the residents from the connection dialogues and actually generate games using like pop-up tents, right? And so these are not meant to be at environmental festivals, but like at a ball game or a Walmart parking lot or at a fish rodeo. And the residents will train them and work with them, and we'll do a few with them and then leave them with all the supplies. We'll have these games so that people can interact and have a good time and also gain a little bit of awareness about issues locally. Another project is that we're working on a legal analysis to help understand what the road responsibilities are as some of our infrastructure becomes more regularly impacted by sea level rise to the point where it doesn't become fiscally sound anymore to keep them up. You know, what are the legal ramifications of that? Can you walk away from a road? And we're working with that with several of the Sea Grant legal teams. And then that project I talked about into E2, we are rolling out the outputs. So there's going to be a way to access and apply that information, and we're developing that right now in sort of an iterative process with people who've been helping us out from the very beginning, telling us what they need, what they don't need to make sure that we're not producing information that isn't both useful and usable. And then of course, whatever else y'all tell us is needed. That's why we're here today, right? What else is Place gonna do? We got 4 people, a lot of energy. We got this whole network of 40 more people who want to do some things. Where do we go next? So how do you get involved? So one, stay connected. We have our website, and there's lots of things on the new website It's beautiful. I'm so happy with it. I had nothing to do with making it. It's great. But you can learn about us and our team. You can learn about a lot more of the work that we have going on than I just had a chance to go over. There are the products that have been produced through this network of people, and then resources, both within our network, but also outside of it. And then if there's any events coming up, you can see that there as well. We also have a Twitter, and we talk about flood events when they're happening. We help our partners elevate their voice and get the word out, like Pensacola, who just did a resilience meeting with the public. And then we also highlight products and efforts and things that are coming out from the group. And then we also have a newsletter. It's at the bottom of every single page. And so the newsletter will come out actually, hopefully in September will be the first one. We wanted to wait until we had this meeting so we knew if there's anything to change. But right now what's in it are feature stories, a toolbox, relevant science, funding opportunities, and then opportunities to either look for data or announce that you have data available. And then maybe one of the most important ways that you can get involved is that we have project teams. We don't undertake any of these efforts with just the staff of place. This is really our network. We just provide some of the momentum to make it happen. And so there are people who provide technical expertise from the network, who are end users that help clarify what they need, and then people who help us actually visualize or make things come to fruition. There are a lot of ways to contribute to those different kinds of roles that are on the projects, whether it's identifying and pursuing the funding streams, if it's serving on advisory groups, if it's serving on an implementation team to actually make things go. I think many of you on this workshop have served in some role in that respect. And another thing is, you don't really need the staff at all. If you see a gap and you've got the means to address it, go for it. So that was a real quick coverage of place. Are there any questions? And you can raise your hand or you can put something in the chat and Carrie will read it out for us. And I don't see any hands. Carrie, are there any questions in the chat?
Nothing right now.
Tina, did you put your hand up? No? Okay.
I didn't mean to.
Okay. I think you were voting to go faster. You want me to talk faster?
I don't know what I did.
Okay. Anyone else? Any questions? Anything that wants clarification from that? All right. Okay, well then we're going to go ahead and move on. And we're going to spend some time exploring the awesome resources that are available to our network. Some of these are generated by the staff at Place. Some of these are generated by other members within the Place network. And some of these come from outside the network, but we felt like were really awesome. So we wanted to highlight them. And so there's kind of two things I want to get our head around, our collective heads around, before we actually put our hands on the resources. And so the first is just to kind of talk about, I use the word paths very loosely, but the idea of sort of how we move forward on sea level rise resilience and how these tools, these resources can fit into that. So there is not a set path for resilience. And I have this picture here of all these, it's sort of like a maze and it's beautiful. And that's kind of like what sea level rise resilience is. Everyone's tracking their own path and doing their own thing, but we're all sort of working in the same direction. And so there are some similar elements though. There is the need for information. There's a need for some kind of action plan, and then there's the need to actually implement that plan. But each of these components have some similarities. You need stakeholder engagement often to do all of these, if not some of those elements, in addition to buy-in. So not only do you want people to be engaged, but you also have to have buy-in to make it happen. There's also the data gathering phase, right? Each of these things, again, you need some information. And another similarity is revisiting. Resilience does not stand still, and it is not just one directional. There's a lot of making sure things are working, checking back in, revisiting, reevaluating. Now that things have been implemented, what do we need to do? But it seems like this question always gets in the way. How much sea level rise should we plan for? And while it is an important question, it seems sometimes to overshadow or dominate all these other things that we're trying to do. So I'm going to quickly talk about different strategies for this question so that then we can move past it and see how we can use these resources. So these are just some projections for a local county. And you can see here there's a wide range, and that makes it difficult. It's why this question of how much we should plan for pops up. But the reality is this is not the likelihood of these scenarios. This is just telling you what is scientifically possible. This is the range of what could happen. And so now what we're talking about is not, okay, we have to plan for all of this, but understanding there's some uncertainty, and there's good reasons for that uncertainty, but we need to think of different ways of how to deal with that uncertainty. And so there's ways to do that. I'm going to go over just a couple of them. One is using risk tolerance. This is a very common established approach for anyone who's been involved in the compact in the Southeast Florida region. If you've kept up with some things happening, well, almost every talk I give, but also like in New Hampshire and in Washington, this is a standard approach. There's also scenario planning. This is used, I know I've seen examples in the Everglades, but this is really common in natural resource management. There's adaptation pathways. I showed you one of those. And we're going to talk about each of these for just a second. And then there's RAD, resist, accept, and direct. And so each of these are a way to deal with uncertainty and to operationalize those sea level rise scenarios so you can move past that question and get into actually getting some work done. So what are some commonalities before we get into how they're different? All of these provide an opportunity to integrate your stakeholders into the process. Additionally, they permit decision-making in an uncertain future. It allows you to move forward with confidence in your choices. Depending on which one of these you pick, it will meet your values or your needs out of that situation. All of them do require clear goals and objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to get done? And they can be used as a standalone or in combination. So quickly, just really quickly, I'm going to talk about how each of these work. There's risk tolerance. So this leverages the fact that each of those scenarios is not equally as likely. You can see here each of the sea level rise scenarios. And then depending on the carbon emission scenario, the likelihood that we'll see that sea level rise scenario. So if there's no change in carbon emissions, we know that low and intermediate low are very likely to happen. And so then if you look down here at some of these lower scenarios, high, extreme, they're very unlikely to happen. And so you can use that information to think about your project timeline and the risk tolerance associated with that project. If it's expensive, you know, is it a critical function? Is it adaptable? There's a whole list of things we can go through, but thinking about these aspects lets you decide which scenario or which of these sea level rise scenarios makes the most sense to plan to. You go out a time and you go pick that scenario, and that's how much sea level rise you'll plan for. Scenario planning is a little bit different. It's not worried about the probable futures, but what's plausible. Okay, what is plausible to happen in some kind of time frame? Let's look at our management actions under different scenarios and see what those outcomes are. And then you can identify actions that are robust under many futures. Maybe it's not ever the very best outcome out of all your options, but if it's the one that's good enough under lots of them, that's something that's robust to the uncertainty. So that could be an option you go with. A good example of when you'd use this is like natural resource planning. So if you think about, say, the risk tolerance one, it might make sense to build something for 4 feet of sea level rise now because it's built, it's strong, you want it up high. That won't work with marshes. If you build it 4 feet high, it's just a pile of dirt. Another are these adaptation pathways. So this is looking at a series of adaptation strategies, and it's very useful for really dynamic situations. And so you develop the pathway from tipping points of when an adaptation strategy won't work anymore. And so you look at how much sea level rise has changed, and because you've already gotten your information about when that adaptation strategy won't be effective, and you see that we're about to hit that much sea level rise, then you can move on to the next strategy, but these strategies are designed to build on each other. So if you look here, you can see if strategy A works and it's the least expensive, but after an observed amount of half a foot of sea level rise has happened, then it makes sense to start using and applying strategy B. And you can see here that strategy B is the next cheapest, it works for a while. And by the time it doesn't work, you can just altogether skip strategy C. And so this works in environments like a barrier island where you don't know what's going to happen on that island and how it's going to look if there has been 2 feet of sea level rise. So instead of investing in that much money now, you can look at strategies that will build on each other. And then the last one, some of you have had training on this. It's called RAD. And so RAD's purpose is to help you acknowledge that there's shifting baselines. And this is really focused on natural resource management, but understanding that there's not enough time, money, or dirt to resist sea level rise or climate change across the board. And so it gives you a space to think about what each of these are. What does resisting really mean? What does accepting really mean? And what does directing really mean? And then you can use them either independently or together to come up with a strategy that makes sense for managing that particular habitat. But again, you have to pick a certain amount of sea level rise that you're planning to in order to do this. And so you can do that a variety of different ways. So you've picked your sea level rise scenario, whether it's that you're going to plan for a certain amount of time in the future and you're going to try and understand if resisting makes sense or accepting, or if you're going to do a pathway, you know how much sea level rise you need to look at. And once that's established, you can get back into these issues. Okay, I need information about how things are going to change. I need to know what actions I can take. I need to think about how to implement this. And that is where our resources come in. And that's what we're going to go take a look at. So the first set of resources we have is that high tide flooding and future storm surge. And so this is for that kind of planning where you know how much water you want to plan for, but it doesn't really mean anything, right? If you're going to plan for 2 feet of sea level rise, what you really want to know is how much is high tide going to come up into my city, or how much storm surge am I going to have to deal with in the future? What footprints are going to be expanded to be in the floodplain, or how much deeper is the water going to be, so I have to adjust freeboard, those kinds of things. So resources to look at that can be found here. Another thing is we talked about that buy-in. How do you get people interested in understanding what's happening, or how do you get people to think about the different things they might want to consider so they can be active participants in the process? These are tools that you'll find there with communication. And then there's population vulnerability. So we talk about the environment, but there's also people, right? We need to know who's at risk, who could be exposed, you know, what kind of demographics are we talking about in terms of people being impacted. And then finally, natural resource vulnerability. If you're thinking about, okay, if I'm, again, planning for a management strategy that I want to see how effective it is under 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot of sea level rise, you would go look at these natural resources to see how does marsh change under 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot. So those are just some examples. Are there any questions about the categories or that process I laid out about, it's not really about how much water, you just have to pick a number, whether it's a couple numbers or a single number. And once you have that strategy, you still have to go to these resources and get yourself some information. So any questions about that? Any questions in the chat, Carrie?
Nothing in the chat, but we do have a raised hand.
Oh, a hand just went up. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, comment, I think, maybe question to you. I really like the dynamic adaptive pathway approach that, and I'm trying to promote that here. So one thing I was curious, you talked about uncertainty. So when you go from one pathway to another, you want to make sure that you're not preempted from implementing a bigger project later that may be associated with one of those lower pathways.
Yeah.
So how do you advise your stakeholders on that? In other words, you might need the land, and the land may not be there when you get to that pathway.
So I think it's less advising the stakeholders and more like understanding what they're willing to do. We present them with some options depending on the question, or if it's a big picture, multiple efforts, or if it's a single project. But once we understand what even could be possible, what there would be buy-in for, what there would be potentially money for, what people could really see themselves doing in a sort of two-way dialogue, then together we build out what makes sense. What order does this go in? And then identifying what things have to be done to make the pathway successful. So it's a conversation. So like, for example, this pathway we're working on now, one of the strategies they wanted us to look at, because they thought it would be possible, was filling in some borrow pits on this barrier island. And it has turned out that that is just not going to happen. Where the political will stands now, it's not there. Residents don't want it. So we have done some separate modeling. We're going to try and look at, what that means, but now all of our strategies, the rest of them are being examined with those borrow pits still existing. And it's not necessarily the best strategy, but that's the strategy that the city is willing to do.
Yeah, just a follow-up, and I have a project from FDOT, and I gave a talk on that to them, which they are very interested in. You don't want to invest, big projects early on. But one aspect is the cost-benefit analysis, and I was wondering if you also advise on that.
We do some of those. We don't have resources for that here. But Obe, you and I can either follow up offline, or we can talk about that maybe during some of the conversations at the end, because I think that's a critical part of all this.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. Any other hands up? Any other questions come in on the chat, Carrie?
Nothing in the chat.
All right. So what you're going to do is you're going to get 2 opportunities to pick a category. So I know there's 4 and that's tough, but you're gonna have to pick the 2 that you think are most relevant to you. And you're gonna get the choice. Sonia's gonna open up breakout rooms here in a minute. And when that happens, you can choose the room that you're gonna go into. I just ask that if you see the room you're interested in is just overflowing with people, maybe pick a different room and then try that one the next time. But we're gonna spend about 15 minutes in each room. So any questions about the process? Sonia, you can go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. All right, and if you have any technical difficulties getting into the room, all right, looks like everybody's back. Thank you, everybody, for coming around and seeing that. I hope it was productive. I've heard some things already about new tools people found that they were excited about, new things to learn about. We are going to go to a break now. We've got about 10 minutes. So please, we will start back promptly at 10:50. But while you're breaking, be thinking about those tools and come back ready to talk about what you didn't see, right? Or what you really liked or how you might use those. All right, enjoy your break. I'll see you in 10 minutes.
Apalachicola for me is probably the most historic port city in the North Florida region. Given that and the amount of historic buildings that are still here, there's a deserved and necessary protection. And as such, the bulk of the historic buildings are in the most susceptible flood zones because the town was established on the waterfront.
My name is Cindy Clark, and I'm the project coordinator for Apalachicola's Achieving Resilience Through Hazard Mitigation. This is a grant that funds the study and recommended mitigation measures to flood-proof and/or elevate publicly and privately owned historically important structures along Apalachicola's commercial waterfront.
I think something I'd like to impart to the citizens in the community of Apalachicola and other residents around the country is the fact that our flooding is increasing. The frequency of flooding is increasing. The intensity of rainfall and runoff is increasing. We're seeing more flooding occurring now, either in coastal areas or interior riverine areas than what we've ever seen. We're seeing a spike in damages that can go upward to almost $100 billion in damages.
We sit at the nexus of the Apalachicola River and the Apalachicola Bay. We're about a quarter of a mile from where they meet. And all of our historic downtown structures are located in this area. It is the economic heart of the city of Apalachicola and actually Franklin County.
I think some of the unique challenges is that you have a very historic downtown area, and the thing that we want to make sure that we're not doing in this community or other communities like it around the country is losing that significant historic culture that we have. There's some really interesting buildings in Apalachicola and things that we don't want to try to provide flood protection to the buildings by changing how those buildings look. You know, some of those were constructed back in the late 1800s, some were constructed in the early 1900s, and we'd like to keep the characteristics of those buildings if we can and still make them flood resistant.
In 2017, the city of Apalachicola completed a vulnerability analysis for the purposes of determining the extent of the city's vulnerability to storm surge and sea level rise. The city imported the NOAA model data sets, 1 to 6 foot increments, into the city's GIS system as layers to show potential impacts of sea level rise on parcel inundation, as well as identify areas of impact to critical infrastructure, roads, historic resources, property values, and the potential economic impact.
This is really a long-term, two-phase project, and we're accomplishing phase 1, identifying and analyzing the structures and preparing non-structural estimates for either elevating or flood-proofing the buildings to make them less vulnerable and more protected as important historic resources in the city.
First step is for us to conduct an assessment to really look at the flood characteristics, like you know, the depth of flooding, duration, velocities, and things, how that affects a structure. Then we look at each individual structure, and look at the condition of it, what it's constructed from. Is it wood frame? Is it brick? Is it concrete? And then from those items, we start to look at what we can do. You know, is it, with the depth of flooding, is it something that we think we could dry flood proof without changing the structure, or would we have to consider elevation of the structure to place it up above the base flood elevation?
The Vulnerability Assessment web application is a planning tool that combines both natural and built environment data with social factors to show us geographically where flooding risks are the greatest. The web app will inform the public of future flooding risks, and decision makers can use it to influence future smart growth and development. Resilience efforts and infrastructure dollars can be prioritized where they are most needed and where they will offer the most protection from future flood events. This tool can also be modified and adapted for other counties and jurisdictions within the Emerald Coast region. This will help strengthen not just Santa Rosa County, but the entire region's resilience to future flood hazards.
So this project, it is a one-year project in which we are assessing vulnerability to flooding throughout Santa Rosa County, Florida. And part of this vulnerability analysis, we're looking at not only environmental factors, such as if you're a lower elevation or a higher elevation, we're also looking at things such as economic and social factors using census data. So this is looking at not just environmental vulnerability, but also those social vulnerabilities. So this way we can use this analysis to help us prioritize mitigation dollars within our county.
So part of this project too, with the vulnerability to flood control that we're working on, is we contracted with the University of Florida with the civic program, which is community voices and informed choices. And then we also contracted with the Natural Resources Leadership Institute. And so we've had some now online training on conflict management, how to run meetings, and then how to really interact with the public. Ultimately, we'll be having a public meeting in the fall via Zoom. But that's actually the civic training for us will help us engage with the community and actually get them to talk to us and communicate what their needs are as far as education, and then also things that they'd like to see changed. And then also to introduce the project also.
Naturally, people want to build and live on the coast, but that puts property and lives at stake during flood events. By planning for flood resilience, we can learn from past and projected impacts, assess risks, and protect property and lives.
for this whole endeavor is really to like progress us to understanding what gaps and needs we might want to address while also understanding what great things are happening right now in the region. So in the chat, we're going to drop a Padlet so that you can go to, I'm going to share my screen. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Padlet, I'm going to show you really quickly and then I'm going to stop sharing. But so we put a Padlet in the chat so that you can add some thoughts here, thinking about those resources you just saw. How could the things you saw be integrated into your work? How could the existing resources be improved? What resources might be missing? And any other comments or reflections overall on these resources. Don't feel like you have to answer all these questions. Just if any of these speak to you, let's spend a couple minutes looking to answer these questions, again, to help us prep when we start thinking about gaps and needs. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because sometimes that gets confusing for people. The link is here in the chat. If you want to go to that Padlet there, click on that link and start entering in a few questions, a few answers to those questions. And I'll be quiet for a few minutes while y'all think about what you might want to put there. And for those of you who are just coming back from the break, over in the chat, there is a link to a Padlet. You don't have to answer all those questions, but take a look at those and maybe answer one or two that you feel like you have a good answer for. I'm starting to see some comments come in. For those of you who might be a little slow coming back from the break, go ahead. There's a Padlet link there in the chat. Click on that and add answers to one or two of these questions if anything resonates with you. Some things we're starting to see how these resources could be used, working with engineers to include natural resources and planning timelines for future impacts. That's a good one. The set inventory is going to be useful for wetland restoration planning. Oh, in the context of blue carbon, that's a good point. Help with communicating. Lots of love for the video diaries. And if you see something you like, there's a little heart button there. You can just click that to show that you like that, that resonates with you too. Some gaps. The temporal patterns of water levels during storm events, how it changes over time. And then expanding hydro-mem to include more areas. So there are some expansions to that are coming. So the whole Big Bend will be on the hydro-mem story map, and the Pascagoula River Delta will be. So you'll be able to see how the projections of how those marshes will change. But moving to the east is a good idea. Yeah, I totally agree with that one on resources that are missing is talking about compound flooding. Definitely. People highlighting the importance of the social vulnerability tools. Needing to set time to periodically review the tools and what's changed. That's what we're doing now. We'll make sure to keep that in. Seeing some need to update the Gulf-wide SLAM modeling. Nice. More comments on how the tools could be integrated, shoreline and marsh restoration design, baseline for community planning from the social vulnerability index. These are some good ones. Does anybody want to come off mute? Sonia, did you know you're sharing your screen? I just want to make sure you knew. But yeah, does anybody want to raise their hand and come off mute? Anything you want to say or comment about the tools? Lots of love for that compound flooding one, I see. All right, lots of good stuff here. I don't see any more people in there adding. Yeah, show Louisiana stuff. Good idea. Yes, we do include St. Tammany's Parish. And the saline wetlands inland migration model. Yeah, there are definitely more models than what we showed for sure on habitat vulnerability. And that's, I think, an important point to make, is that this is just a subset. There are more that are available. So Gulf Tree, I highly recommend considering looking at Gulf Tree before you pick a horse for sure, because there are other resources in there. All right, so Sonia, if you want to stop sharing, I think I see the comments winding down and no one seems interested in coming off mute. Thanks again for your thoughts. My big advice here is to just please remember these comments, and this Padlet will be up for the next 2 days. Whenever we start to talk about what gaps and what needs we may be able to take off of that list and what needs to be added to it. So now we're going to transition. One of the big things that we did last year or 2 years ago was have members of our network share examples of successes, next steps, and challenges in their pathway to sea level rise resilience. So we're going to hear first from Cynthia Cannon, then from Carolyn Martin, and then from Chase Glisson. We have our team of C's. I didn't do that on purpose, but we've got Chase, Carolyn, and Cynthia. Cynthia has just recently completed a sea level rise vulnerability analysis, and so she's at that sort of beginning stage of that pathway. And so we'll get to see from her perspective, her successes, the next steps and challenges associated with that. And then Carolyn is several years out from that kind of endeavor. So we'll get to see how this looks as we move forward in time. And then Chase is tackling this from a whole other perspective, thinking about the environment and about some of the work they've been doing around septics and other aspects to do with wastewater, environmental health, and the risk to sea level rise. So with that, my ask for you, for the rest of you who aren't speaking, please put your questions for the speakers in the chat. We're going to let all three of them speak first, and then we'll have them in a panel style take some questions. All right, take it away, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you, Renee. And remind me too at the end that we do have a link to the city's webpage where we have our vulnerability assessment available via story map. And someone had brought up the story map before, so we can share that at some point too. And I was kind of focus on the process a little bit and not so much the output from the vulnerability assessment, the scientific output so much, because I think you can see that on your own if you want to do a deeper dive into it. But kind of this lesson learned for those getting started, well, I'll just back up. So in 2018, City Council formed Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Task Force, which Carrie Stevenson was on as well, along with me. And one of the recommendations that came out of that task force report was to pursue a vulnerability assessment for the city. And so that's what we did. And so I guess last year we applied for a grant through the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, their Coastal Resilience Program. And we were successful to fund the vulnerability assessment. That was a $75,000 grant. And then our city administration, our top leaders here, were so supportive of this effort that they, even though a match wasn't required, they went ahead and added an additional $10,000 match to go along with that project. So we ultimately had $85,000 to spend on this vulnerability assessment. We had a great consulting team. That was Erin Deedy. She's out of South Florida. Small group, just a really fantastic job. And I say all that because even with this great team in place that I will say by all accounts hit the ground running, we had, this is a 1-year timeline to complete this process. And I thought it had a fairly robust community engagement component to it, but factor in COVID and that changed the way we did things a little bit, as everybody knows that already. So for those that are just getting started, and even this being truly a well-oiled machine, I just can't stress enough how quickly that 1-year timeline, how much stress that places on decision making during this timeline. And for example, one of the things you're doing initially in that vulnerability assessment is you're doing this gap analysis. And so for me, at times, just about 2 years with the city of Pensacola, this was very, very informative because you're finding out, well, what all data exists in these other departments throughout the city. So I will tell you, I don't know how many of you on the call are in local government, but we have a tendency to work in silos around here. And that's even with the best efforts at communication. So what they're doing this gap analysis part to really get people to come out and talk about what databases they already had and that we're willing to share. At this point, we would find that in our engineering department, some people thought like some of these data sets were real proprietary. They didn't want to share them. So it was a little bit of a problem. So some of this is internal. This kind of slow dragging us down was somewhat internal. So if I were to do this part again, I would have had a lot more prep with my coworkers in these various departments that I was going to be leaning on for information, like our emergency management folks, engineering, public works by far was very, very critical to this process. So as much as you can do ahead of time, which I know in a perfect world, I guess we would all do that, but when you're chasing grants and you're kind of going this fast and furious, anyway, it doesn't come out that perfect. So, but the gap analysis, again, I have to tell people again, this was all establishing a baseline. We're looking at what we do have and then what's the condition of that data set? Is it a pretty coarse data set, meaning it's dated? Does it have very little value? Do we want to prioritize that for spending money on an improved data in the future? But once we did kind of get more of our internal folks on board and kind of realizing, well, now how important this is to have this assessment in order to be eligible for these pots of money in Governor DeSantis's resiliency program. Like for instance, his capital improvements program, which is $500 million, your projects needed to be outlined in this vulnerability assessment to be eligible to go after funding for those capital improvement projects. So now with that knowledge, we have a lot of interest from our other departments, right? Because now you're seeing it didn't do any good to not really be forthcoming with some of this data where we have weaknesses, especially in our stormwater systems. And so again, just lessons learned. So one of the things that when we did get, I don't want to pick on engineering. I know there's probably lots of engineers in the room, so I'm trying not to. It's a little planning engineering thing. We love to do that. But this is just a good example. So I did identify some projects with our stormwater, our valve system. And we have quite a few in vulnerable areas that were identified throughout the assessment. And we know that these stormwater valves need to be replaced. What our engineering director would end up telling us at some point is that, well, there's close to $300,000 identified to replace throughout the city, the ones in the most vulnerable areas. But later he kind of said, well, but it's not going to really do any good because once they're subject to the saltwater corrosion. And so even though we replace them, they don't last very long. So now we have these faulty valves, right? So we've just compounded already a vulnerable system. So maybe we'll find a solution to that, or maybe somebody has ideas about that. So Again, that's where I was just emphasizing some of this stuff, that these discussions can be done in such a vacuum that you don't want to get diminishing returns from doing this work. But so it's still very much lessons learned. And then overall, I know this was back when Governor Scott was in, he created the parallel flood statute. So a lot of cities and counties needed to update their comprehensive plan to be in compliance with that statute. So that came out of this vulnerability assessment as well. So that was a real good tie to our actual planning. So we'll be in that process of updating our comprehensive plan and then our land development code. And for this scope of work, since this was for the DEP grant, our scope of work with our consultant was very much tied to the scope of work for the actual grant application to be competitive. So there was some disappointment, I think, throughout the community that, or I'd say the community, just disappointment, but understanding that our scope is limited to sea level rise. So we didn't include precipitation modeling or storm surge modeling that we'd like to see in the future. And there's other big decisions that were made that our consultant would talk about that other communities spend a lot more time on. You don't want this vulnerability assessment to come out and scare people, right? So you said, some communities decide not to put building footprints in their map series. Some decide not to show priority areas. We decided to show all that information, decided more information was better. If it became confusing later, we'd rather take it out than kind of add it later. But these are things that are probably going to play out differently in your communities, depending on the political mindset where you are. So things to keep in mind too. So we have this real science side of it and the engineering side of it. And then we also have this other kind of higher level process side and planning side, and all that comes together. But the more you can figure that out in advance, the better. So just a few other things. So since this, as we were in the middle of this vulnerability assessment, FDEP was raising the bar the entire time on what the details that needed to be in this type of vulnerability assessment. So like Renee said, right as we kind of wrapped ours up, the governor announced their next coastal resilient programs grant funding cycles, and with their opening the application, I want to say September 1st. And so even though we had really just concluded our vulnerability assessment, it already wasn't up to speed with the new criteria for applying for this next round of grants. So we're right now bringing our consulting group back on board. We have a modified now, another scope of work to be more comprehensive. So we'll apply for another vulnerability assessment grant. We think we'll be competitive in doing so, and we will update this to now include some more modeling, hopefully the high tide flooding. Hopefully we'll do a little more robust social vulnerability index. That was part of this past grant as well. But it was it wasn't a very involved. There can be a lot more to it. So I like this neighborhoods at risk component, but I'm hoping I can maybe add some of these going forward. And then I think the main thing that we just continually stress to the community, because for some you're doing too much, for some you're not doing enough, right? So I think for us, we just kept having to say that this initial vulnerability assessment was truly a starting point, a jumping off point. It was the beginning. We were going to be building on this now, by all means forever, I'm sure. So it wasn't just one and done. So I think that was just important I used to try to open with that statement. This is just the beginning. It may not have everything that you want in it. And I do feel like that for ultimately $85,000, we had a pretty phenomenal product come out of it. So, and I'll just kind of wrap it up with that. I'm about 10 minutes here. We're trying to keep it down to, Renee said 8. I think I hit 9.
No, that was perfect. And I love the layout of the lessons learned. That was awesome. And so remember to please put questions for Cynthia in the chat. We're going to now look ahead, right? She was talking about that was the starting point. Let's look ahead a little bit to Carolyn and see how things are going with her. If Carolyn, you want to tell us a little bit about your successes, some of your challenges, and next steps.
Sure. Thank you, Renee. Yeah, we're a little further down the track, and we have some similarities with everything that Cynthia just discussed. But if you're not familiar with Ocean Springs, we're coastal. We do have beachfront. We also have just as much bayou frontage. So we have a compound issue, as was discussed in the Padlet. So our grant that we received was roughly half of what they had received. We had a much smaller amount, and we looked at sea level rise only. Again, that was the limitations of the funding. And even though that's only really one element that we deal with on a regular basis. So we looked at sea level rise primarily where the beachfront occurs, and we did get some data. And I've always said that the best result that we had from that is it started a conversation that we've been able to keep going. So that has allowed me to bring it up at every point. Whenever flooding is an issue or resiliency is an issue, I can bring that back up and just keep that in the dialogue, which has been very helpful. Now, part of that work that we did was to look at how we could include some code issues to help work with developers and help promote more resilient infrastructure designs and elements. If anybody who has worked in that planning side of it, changing the code and putting in requirements is a very touchy subject and not always a popular one, never a popular one. I'll just rephrase that. And so what we did is we incorporated a different type of subdivision, which we call the conservation subdivision, which gave you credit and points and allowed you a little more flexibility if you included these resilient type, maybe green infrastructure, or just thinking outside of the traditional norm of construction as it pertains to drainage. The problem that we've run into, I'd say primarily we just haven't had a successful project come through that yet. It's, I guess, still early on, and it's not like we're a small community. We don't have a large subdivision coming in every day, thank goodness. But the areas that haven't developed are problematic because of flooding. We have lots of areas that are just very flat. So those areas are not prone to flooding necessarily. They don't have an obvious connection to sea level rise because they say we're not near the coast. But we are pretty much a peninsula, so everything's connected to sea level rise. So again, that's an opportunity for me to insert that in the conversation. But where we've come into conflict, we do have one that's trying to use this path, but it's where the traditional infrastructure elements of the project meet these green infrastructure or resiliency. And the trade-offs that the developers are asking us to make with the traditional side in order to help us out with the more resilient type new way of thinking. So we're kind of at a standstill with this particular project right now, because in order for the drainage to work, they're asking for compromises in the remaining in the roadway and water sewer infrastructure that just aren't going to work. So I think lesson learned from that is, yes, it's wonderful to have this tool and to have this opportunity to work with developers, but what we're going to have to look at is how to refine the traditional side of our code to make sure that they pair well together. If we don't give a range of opportunities to developers, it's not going to be the popular thing to do. You either use a stick or a carrot, and sticks are not very popular and carrots are just don't seem to be sweet enough yet. So we're still looking at it, and I think we're still going to have to find ways to make that work. Most of our area that is sea level rise prone, which I will say, let me rephrase, obviously sea level rise prone on the beach fronts, most of that is already developed. So our undeveloped areas are more to the northeast and more inland. So what we're looking at now is saying, yes, our study looked at sea level rise and people don't think it applies to them, even though everyone has a ditch somewhere near their house and the water comes from somewhere and goes to somewhere. So what we're trying to have the conversation now is the sea level rise does affect the groundwater level. So everything is rising and the water has no place to go. So we are getting more frequent flooding. So our next project that we are going to look at is, and that we've applied for some funding for, is more of a watershed study. The county is doing one now. We plan to kind of tap onto that and get down to a more really a specific level, drill down into the weeds, as we say, to create tools to really understand how our drainage system works. No different than a water system or a transit system. You know, what are those pathways that need to be there? How can we best maintain it? And then where are problem areas? And this is kind of where I really am in the middle between what Cynthia's done and then what I'm sure Chase will talk about is how that impacts our utilities. We know that we have a tremendous issue with infiltration in our sewer system, that we know that this is only becoming worse because of sea level rise and the other environmental factors. So how can we use the information that we're getting through sea level rise to address those as well? So hopefully that'll be our next endeavor. And I think what we've just kind of come around the other way too is bringing the idea up of a vulnerability assessment. That's not a very popular term to use because nobody wants to be vulnerable. And I'm sure that's what some of the concerns were in getting some participation, but nobody wants to consider themselves vulnerable. So I think we're putting together the pieces that will support us being able to identify our vulnerable spots a little bit better and feed into the capital improvement plan that we are also working hard to develop. So we're kind of in the middle, and the best thing I can say about it is the conversation has continued. And every time something does go wrong, every time we have a large flooding event, we're able to bring it up again and say, see, we still need to look at this. This is a problem. It's not just the rain coming down, it's also the water coming up. And so while I'd hope to have a wonderful project by this point, hopefully by next year, we will have been able to work this one developer through the project and say that we do have a tool that works for a conservation type subdivision that will address drainage in a positive and resilient way. So that kind of covers all our bases. If there's any questions, but I do really feel like I'm directly in between those two topics, as far as we didn't have as much success, I think, as I wanted, but we still, it's been a wonderful thing and a wonderful conversation to be able to insert in all other aspects of infrastructure planning and maintenance.
Thanks, Carolyn.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was awesome. And remember, like Carolyn said, if you got questions, let's start putting them in the chat. We will have time for questions after we've heard from everyone. So we've heard from Cynthia, and now we progress along the path to Carolyn. And so now we're going to have Chase, who's with the Jackson County Utility Authority in Mississippi. And finally, after, I don't know, 13 years on the Gulf Coast, remembering to specify there's multiple Jacksons, Jackson counties, Jacksonvilles. So Chase, with that, do you want to take it away and tell us a little bit about your successes and your challenges and your next steps?
Sure. And again, I'm Chase Glisson, Engineering Director with Jackson County Utility Authority. Thank you both, Cynthia and Carolyn, for that kickoff there. I would argue that we're probably a little farther behind in what we're trying to get accomplished. I guess I would say that most of our decisions we make now, we may not see the true benefit of for many, many years. So we're certainly trying to get ahead of the game on planning, and where we feel we're behind, try to get a little more educated on how sea level rise impacts Jackson County and obviously the infrastructure that the JCUA manages. But just to speak to who JCUA is, we offer wholesale wastewater service to the cities of Ocean Springs, Goshen, Pascagoula, Moss Point, and some of the utility districts within Jackson County. We offer wholesale water service. City of Ocean Springs and a particular utility district take advantage of that option. And we also offer retail services from a water distribution and a sewer collection service in the non-city limits, if you will, the rural areas of Jackson County. Serve roughly 113,000 people out of the maybe 144,000 populated within Jackson County. As you can expect, as Ms. Carolyn mentioned, we've got many, many miles of coastline and bayous that obviously impact the infrastructure that we try to manage and use to serve the residents each day. Looking back through sea level rise, with some storm surge considered through the years, back in 1969, Jackson County was impacted by Hurricane Camille. We received roughly 11 feet of storm surge. That affected a lot of city-owned plants, wastewater treatment plants at the time. Then roughly, if you kind of look ahead, 1972, you had passage of the Clean Water Act, and a lot of the monies and surge, if you will, as far as attention to how that was impacting our water quality. 1980, Mississippi Gulf Coast Regional Wastewater Authority was created, initially envisioned to be a coast-wide authority. Due to some other things that kind of went on at the time, it was basically reduced to just serve Jackson County. But with that creation, you had a lot of planning take place. In 1983, the Regional Wastewater Authority, which is now the JCUA, acquired the city treatment plants and rebuilt those facilities. And now there's 4 treatment facilities serving Jackson County. 1998, we had roughly 10 foot of storm surge from Hurricane George at 3 of those facilities. 2005, Hurricane Katrina impacted one of those major facilities, roughly 18 feet of storm surge at the time. Millions of dollars in FEMA money after that were pumped into 3 of those facilities to try to rebuild them and reinforce those for future events. As I mentioned, 2006, the Regional Wastewater Authority became the JCUA. We were added to, we had services added to our obligation to where we had to provide wholesale water and retail services within the county. In doing so, there was some support to try to, maybe not try to, but there was an expectation that a lot of the population would move away from the coastline just due to some of those storm impacts. So you had millions of dollars in infrastructure, backbone infrastructure that was built upland, if you will, away from the coast in the intent to maybe catch some of that growth that may occur inland. We kind of saw that some of those projections were maybe over projections in the sense that everyone does like to live on the coast, and it may be hard to kind of let go of that. 2006, JCUA began to embrace installation of pressure systems opposed to your traditional gravity sewer. We began seeing some impacts through the years where gravity had maybe caused some unintended consequences as it relates to cost of treating I&I, as Carolyn mentioned, but also just the cost to maintain those systems through the years along the coastline, where you do have impact from salinity, impact from salinity where you have corrosion of salt water impacting that infrastructure, flooding impacting that infrastructure, and then obviously storm events that impact that infrastructure. 2010, JCUA completed construction of decentralized and effluent systems in upland areas of the county. So it wasn't just embracing or trying to use those systems within the low-lying or the flood-prone areas, but we had started embracing the benefits of being able to pump many, many miles with this infrastructure, saving capital and management costs in the process. 2014, JCUA completed a facility plan to potentially relocate the primary plant that was impacted during Hurricane Katrina. 2015, we purchased a collection system that abuts the coast, so we got a good taste of how that gravity system is impacted during storm events. So I would say that plays into some of the decision making that we continue to make. 2017, Hurricane Nate impacted the collection system. We had a number of lift stations flooded. We had to raise the panels. We worked with FEMA to attempt to do so. Didn't get as much FEMA assistance in that. So the rural customers that we mentioned had to kind of bear some of that cost, which is not something that we look forward to. 2018, JCUA partnered with the Corps of Engineers through the Corps of Engineer 219 Civil Works program. We began 30% design on a new water reclamation facility, which would consolidate 3 of our treatment facilities, get them away from these areas that are being impacted by the storm surge, try to find a more resilient approach, more resilient location, with some creative concepts where we're going to basically go to 100% reuse, taking the wastewater generated from the cities and treating it to industrial use and then serving it back to the industry that we have local, which includes Chevron. This will reduce and draw on our water off of the river that is currently as it is done today through the county. 2020, we partnered with the Mississippi State Extension Service to make use of the Gulf Tree resources that were mentioned above as it relates to projecting location of the treatment facilities and its impacts from the sea level rise and storm surge in the area. 2021, we began planning stages providing effluent pressure sewer to unsewered areas of South Central Jackson County between Ocean Springs and Gaucher. And we're proud to say we at least have a plan to serve every underserved area within Jackson County that we have service to as it relates to these areas that are flood prone. So we have a plan. We have grant commitments to take these lots off of on-site wastewater generation and convert them to a public system. So that's something that we look forward to being able to complete here very soon. 2021, through a partnership with the MSU Extension Service, we completed a white paper highlighting current individual on-site wastewater systems that were failing as a result of sea level rise, proposed systems that will be impacted by the sea level rise, and the prioritization of the underserved areas affected by sea level rise. Excuse me. This white paper will be packaged with our grant applications that we submit in the future as it relates to trying to connect failing on-site wastewater systems throughout the county. Speaking to vulnerability assessments, we have a proposed commitment from FloodWise to review JCUA's wastewater system, and which will be evaluating vulnerability. We'd like to say we're a little ahead of that in the sense that we're trying to consolidate 3 treatment facilities, but we do want to take a step back and look at the collection system and some of the lift station locations as well to see if maybe we can consolidate those and maybe go to kind of get away from these traditional gravity systems where we can. And then lastly, proposed as the 2030 lookout, we do have intent to construct the water reclamation facility and begin demolition of the 3 treatment plants that we mentioned. Some of the challenges that we've seen through the years, reduced life cycle of the infrastructure resulting in increased costs, recurring impact from tidal and storm surge to major infrastructure. Obviously, sea level rise is included in that, which affects our asset investment. Something that we don't take too lightly is the fact that much of this infrastructure is put in using loans, if you will, maybe SRF or some type of USDA consideration. Usually those are maybe a 20-30 year repayment. We kind of started to see that some of those assets weren't seeing that full life. In a sense, you'd get upside down on something where you were impacted by a storm or a surge event. So another challenge is the true cost of treated floodwaters with the corrosion that you're going to get as it relates to the after effects of those floods. Some of the challenges that I don't know that fully been embraced yet is regulations not being, I think to Carolyn's statement earlier, changing regulations is difficult, but the placement of these assets in these flood prone areas, in these areas that are projected to be impacted by sea level rise, because the decision we make today to put in a station, that station may have a 50-year life by the time you actually replace it in the future. So it's certainly going to be impacted by some of the projections that we have today on sea level rise, which in the area, have as much as maybe 18 inches over that 50-year period. And then breaking the trend, in our industry, gravity is the way, gravity sewer. So JCUA has tried to kind of take a step back and embrace the idea of some of the modular systems, the septic tank effluent systems, the pressure systems, understanding that we've got to pump many, many more miles to get something, to get the wastewater where it's got to go for treatment. Another challenge, in my opinion, we've got, forget the water wastewater, just look at how it's impacting residents. How's that 18-inch, 2-foot sea level rise going to impact the location that people are still in currently plan to build within Jackson County? We attempt to source more resilient materials to allow for that planning to occur as it relates to the wastewater systems. That can be difficult, obviously, in today's time with the material market. And then just trying to make the best overall decision for the customer and JCUA and communicate why we made that decision. Very quickly, the successes, again, we've been able to install backbone infrastructure that is out of that flood prone or that impact area. We've tried to adopt some local regulations to address placement of infrastructure, improve the use of resilient materials as it relates to jointless pipe, composite manholes, rain guard covers, waterproof wet well lids, composite liners, and then HDPE and steel discharge pipes, because that's actually one of probably the fastest areas that break down within a wastewater system are the discharge pipes with that pump station. And a lot of that has to do with corrosion associated with some of the salt water that obviously gets pumped through the system at times. Again, use to the pressure systems opposed to the gravity systems. Again, just kind of highlighting, from 2008 to current day, we've connected approximately 1,500 lots in these areas, of which maybe 800, I would guess, are probably around 800 are pressure systems. So that's going to reduce the future opportunity of failure of those systems and really the planned maintenance on those systems. We've got ongoing review and cost benefit completion for converting failing on-site wastewater systems within other parts of the county. And some of the next steps that we're looking at considering, we want to continue to review the expected impacts from sea level rise, understanding that many of those impacts start at our customer base inside the cities at our wholesale customers. So trying to work with them to kind of educate or at least make sure that they've got the resources that we have available. And taking an even further step back and looking at groundwater inundation, which is something I don't know that we fully embraced just yet, and how sea level rise impacts the groundwater from an impact on wastewater and possibly potable water. And then possibly try to educate or continue to try to educate our regulators as to maybe embracing these changes, not just at the local level, but obviously at the state level. Continue to consider cost benefit of our decisions. Try not to look, just ahead, but obviously look at that 30 plus, maybe even that 50-year lookout, understanding that most infrastructure will be used for that length of time. And then continue to learn from our industry partners. Some of the research that we had done recently in March, there was a posting by the state of Hawaii Sea Grant group, actually looking at how sea level rise is causing wastewater leakage to coastal waters. So that kind of speaks to the wastewater side, but also the stormwater side, to Carolyn's point earlier on looking at some of the impacts there. But the study ultimately concluded that groundwater inundation and wastewater discharge to coastal water is occurring as a result of sea level rise. And then what does all this mean for us? Sea level rise is a current issue. It's not a future issue. It's something that we've been trying to embrace here within JCUA at a local level. And then when you really take a look at it, the decision that we make today on infrastructure is going to carry the weight for the next 50 years, which is kind of a hard pill to swallow, is that, some of the decisions you made in the last 10 years, you may not get to correct, if you will, for the next 50 years, just due to cost and some other reasons. So the way of thinking certainly got to change as we embrace that this is a real thing. It's going to impact us day to day. So I may have went long-winded there. I apologize, Renee.
It's okay. I didn't get my hook out yet. Thank you, Chase. That was a lot of good stuff. Sometimes you have sound bites. All three of you today, though, did, where I wished I could have just clipped that and kept it in my pocket to show people. So I think all three of y'all should be spotlighted and showing right now. There are some questions in the chat. So Cynthia answered one, but just so everyone saw, Cynthia, do you know what prompted your city council to establish a climate adaptation and mitigation task force?
Yeah, we had one really passionate city councilor who stayed really persistent about forming that task force, and eventually she was successful. I thought she did it right too, because she made it regional. It wasn't city staff. Even though it was focused on the city of Pensacola, the task force was drawn from public and private sector across the region. So they did bring in a good team in. And since that time, we've actually had a change in our council, our elected officials. And we right now probably have almost, I would say 100% of our city council is very passionate about coastal resiliency. So, so we have this alignment with our elected officials, and also our mayor's office and mayor staff are also. So we have, with that alignment, it's very encouraging for I think for our future, how we're going to tackle projects. And then something Carolyn said reminded me of something else too. I just thought it was interesting, because our land development code does incentivize resilience in our code. We offer density transfer bonuses and some things like this, if you will illustrate superior site design or green building and things like this. That's been on the books since 2006. We don't have a lot of new projects. We have mostly infill development here now. We're so built out. We did have a large, I say 3 or 4 acre swath of land on the water, on the bay, that was being developed for an apartment complex. And so they actually came in, this is just in the past several months, to take advantage of that density bonus and try to, and to illustrate that superior site design. the double-edged sword for that was that the neighborhood didn't like the sound of density transfer. It seemed like we were giving away a lot to the developer, and we weren't at all. But the amenities that they were proposing for this site to keep this open to the public and do promenades and things like this, and really allow public access and still public views, which you don't see always, was a big, I want to say, a big price tag on their project. But nonetheless, it was still fought hard by the community of seeing that. So even though you have some of these good things on the code, we still have that. We could have educated that community all day long on the public benefit, but it still didn't matter. At the end of the day, it was a high density development. So boom, that was kind of that. Then I saw another question about the social vulnerability index. So yes, per the grant, there was a component that we were required to do that. We were required to use the CDC data for that and census tract data. So we didn't get real creative. That I feel like we kind of checked that box. So it's part of our vulnerability assessment. I just have to refer to it as a starting point, I think. And I want to say that CDC data was designed for emergency managers, I think, and not so much for a study like this, but nonetheless, there was requirements, so we used it. But I'll segue and then I'll close out. So what we are in the process of doing now, we're working with UWF, Environmental Department, and their staff. We're applying for a grant through the Gulf Research Program to now do further analysis on our vulnerability assessment through this equitable lens. So if that award is funded, if that grant is funded, that'll be a 3-year project that will be a real deep dive into how our marginalized communities might be further impacted. So that'll get into like these real good, I think, discussions with the community, and that'll be a great effort if we're successful. And if we're not, we still plan on pursuing those goals for the city.
You'll find another door to go through, right?
We will. Yes, we will.
So another question here I thought was interesting, and I think we've heard you from Chase. You talked a lot about a mindset change, right, from the sort of traditional idea and approaches, and thinking about the decisions you're making now. And one of the questions kind of pointed out that Carolyn and Cynthia had similar themes of like, you got to keep doing this. It's not a stop. And so, do y'all envision in general, or do you think already is occurring, this change in mindset to move beyond a single project accomplishing this, and this being more of an evaluation and progression approach?
Yes, I do think you have a change in mindset. I don't know that it's it's almost like a wave approach. I think you've got it at the important level. You've got it at the staff level. You've got it at the maybe not all engineers, but obviously some engineers are starting to embrace that to some degree. But you definitely have to get it to the board level because they are the final decision makers. So to get it to that political level is certainly the importance, which I don't know, just for me personally, I don't know that that's there yet. But I definitely see, we're definitely making waves, put it that way.
I definitely agree with that. And I'll add on to that. Usually the only way to get the political and social attention and support for it is for something bad to happen. So that being said, we do have a couple of areas that need improvement, and most of our development also is infill, but the problem is the drainage because it's so flat. And then you also have the sea level rise, the groundwater, the infiltration. So as we get some of these areas that are trying to develop infill wise, they're problematic. And now all of a sudden, the city is having to address it on a bigger level. So we have a couple of projects, the Dina Road project. Everybody says, well, why have you never widened it? Well, because all of the infrastructure has to be replaced and you've got a flooding problem. But now we've got a major apartment complex going right there and a grocery store going right there. So all of a sudden now I'm getting support and I'm getting the engineering funding to fix the road because now they want me to fix it tomorrow rather than the last 15 years we've been saying it's a problem. So, but it's allowed me to insert in the conversation is we had to do a lot more hydrology on that section of roadway than you would for a typical project because it's so flat that if it tips one way or another, we're going to make it difficult for the private development. So the only way that it's gotten the support that it has, that I'll say currently over the last 6-12 months, is because there was a private development at risk. And finding those opportunities to highlight, not in a negative way, but to highlight those opportunities to apply what we've learned as far as sea level rise and flooding and resiliency, and then creating a project to point to, I think is really the only way to get that mind shift. And it's a long process. I've been chatting this for, I don't know how long now. And now it's not just coming from me, at least internally on my side. Yeah, engineers are slow to come to the table until they see a benefit for their client. And that's happened a couple of times, so.
And I can make fun of engineers because my dad's an engineer, so I feel like I have a certain right. So it's in my family.
I'm not disagreeing with either of you. I'll say that.
But Hurricane Sally was certainly a wake-up call for folks around here. So you're right, Carolyn. Sometimes, unfortunately, it takes something bad to happen. They've always said after a major event like that, you have about 2 years to update your building codes and things like that. After that, people's memories are short. But I don't think memories are so short anymore. And then another good thing for the city is that after one of the task force recommendations was to hire a sustainability coordinator. And so we now have that person on board, which has been a great help for getting our message out there.
So we have time for one more question, and then I'm just kind of, you may not want to answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And a sidebar, Chase, Tina Sanchez was hoping you could share that white paper. But so the question to sort of wrap us up is, each of you had mentioned a little bit in passing, particularly Chase and Cynthia, the benefits of state level activity on the topic, whether it's from funding. Chase, you'd explicitly called out regulations coming from the state. And so I'm just wondering if you want to speak to the benefit of that at all, if you feel like it's missing, if you feel like it's been helpful. I feel like, Cynthia, you represent a sort of different space with the Parallel Flood Act versus over in Mississippi, where you had an engineer ask for regulations. So I don't know if y'all want to each just take a quick 30 seconds or so to talk about the role of the state level activities and what you're trying to get accomplished.
I'm happy to start.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay, well, Whitney Gray, Renee probably knows, she's at the state, she's I think kind of the head of their coastal resilience program, and the state staff has been absolutely amazing in helping us, I'm sure the local governments as well, pursue our resilience goals. So I can't have enough, I don't have enough, I have so much positive feedback to give them. And they continue to be there and help us all along the way with our community outreach and so forth. So in the 30 seconds, yeah, the state of Florida Coastal Resilience Program is amazing. And the funding for this next round for the planning grants is $20 million. And for capital improvement grants, $500 million. So pretty significant what the governor said. I think that's kind of putting his money where his mouth is. So 2 thumbs up for me.
And really from my perspective, if we embrace it on a planning level, what I'm trying to get accomplished is, or at least I'd like to see, is it to be pretty consistent so that, JCUA is not having to comment to the state, to come back to a local developer that, no, you can't place something here. You'd like to see that maybe our local targeted regulations mirror the state regulations, so that not only are you not building in floodplain, now you start to embrace sea level rise, has its own barrier, if you will, or own area that you don't want to build in. Something just as basic as that, so that at least that's been evaluated at the local level. I don't think you have an issue from a utility authority or even a city level from that embracing, but just from a developer level, you get a lot of consultants that, it is kind of living or working in a silo at times, not trying to embrace all of the moving parts that go along with it. So if you had it at the state level, I think it would just make it easier for those consultants to do what they're trying to do.
I definitely agree. And that's what I was hoping that you would say, Chase, because if we can come in and say that there's a state regulation for this, it kind of takes it out of the equation, because that's usually what we get back is, yeah, but it's not really required, is it? So embracing these concepts on a higher level for us to be able to refer to, both on the county level, the regional level, and the state level, would really help us kind of change the mindset on the local level. Yeah, it's not a problem. We can embrace it all we want, but getting the developers to not push back as much. I think that that can only really help from the state level.
And I will tell you, just to add to that quickly too, yeah, because a lot of what, to be eligible to even apply for these grant funds from the state right now, you have to have conducted some of these projects. You have to have a vulnerability assessment. So that mandate is a pathway to funding, significant amounts of funding. So that takes a lot of argument out of it for us at my level.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for being willing to say that. I appreciate it. Just a big round of applause. You can use your reactions to give applause to our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your journeys on sea level rise resilience from very different perspectives and actions and activities. This was very helpful, I think, for setting up the conversations we're going to have over the next 2 days, or the rest of today and then in tomorrow. So now we are going to transition, and I'll unspotlight you guys so people aren't just staring at you while you work. We're now going to take just a few minutes, because there are a lot of them, to look at your gaps and needs. So this is in your folders. There's 3 pages. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pull those out. Sonia, if you could drop the materials link in the chat for people to go and get that. It's a PDF. You want to download it. I'm not going to go over all of these right now. The goal here is to just briefly touch on these and orient you, and then you can take some time today, and then we'll get into them a little more in depth tomorrow. What I'm going to do is share an online version. This is not what yours look like. Don't worry. Wait, hang on. I'm sharing the wrong screen. But you will see this tomorrow, but it's the same thing. It's just color coded a little differently. So what you see here on the gaps and needs sheet is an outline of what over time the Sentinel Site Cooperative and Now Place has been collecting. You may also see common themes from places like the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. And for those of you who are on the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Advisory Committee, we also have input from there as well that helped shape these. So what you see across these 3 sheets is some color coding. If you see something that's color coded green, either outlined on your sheet or green here on the screen, that means that substantial progress has been made towards addressing this gap or need that's been previously identified. Yellow means we're working on it. We got some things going. We're going to be there soon. And then red means we haven't really made a lot of progress in that particular vein. And so I'm not going to, again, read all of these right now, but I'd want you to kind of take a look, and some of these you'll see italicized text underneath. And on these, there are descriptions of the progress that has happened. So for example, if you're looking at this ensemble of models providing perspectives on sea level rise impacts and inundation, that's green, because as we show here, many partners, many agencies, many organizations are providing an ensemble of models, and many of those we just looked at. But if you see over here, you know, the need for improved bathymetric data in nearshore waters, it's yellow, because while we're making some progress on that, data collection is always slow, and there isn't a sustained pot of funding right now going after that. This is also labeled by page. So if you're trying to follow along, like this would be at the top of page 2. So things that you might want to look at when you're reviewing this. We looked at a lot of tools. On our Padlet, we identified tools or gaps. For example, the fact that there isn't very much compound flooding in any of those resources. We heard Carolyn and Cynthia and Chase just talk about the need for state legislation or state action. Scary word, legislation, I'll take it back. State action on these topics. Maybe it doesn't fit as a gap or need. Maybe it is something that we need to discuss later on, but be thinking about what you don't see on this list. Additionally, be thinking about what you think is really important. The last thing I want to point out is you can see when we had something highlighted as a priority. So for example, the set table inventory, in supporting strategic placement of these, we have a set inventory and a map of those, and it's green because we just updated it. We've kept that up, we've updated it. Like I said, Mike and Sarah did that kind of thing. But you can see where priorities popped up And the reason I want to point that out is tomorrow we're going to set our priorities for 2021 and 2022. And so it helps you understand that when things are prioritized, what kind of stuff comes out of it. One more thing I wanted to add, there was a 2019 priority on saltwater intrusion. And we just finally made some progress on that. Sonia, if you'll drop in the chat that link. We had a document, a synthesis document put together, and it's now available. But again, it just recently became available. So that is something for y'all to look at if you'd like, that helps focus on this one to understand, because not a lot of progress was made on that one over the past 2 years, where we might need to go with that. We heard a lot about groundwater today. We heard a lot about groundwater and about saltwater intrusion and the corrosion of that. So take a look at what we have and take a look at that particular gap has at least a little more information about characterizing it. Are there any questions about these gaps and needs or about what the expectation is between now and tomorrow with them? I am going to go over them a little more in depth in the morning. I just kind of wanted to introduce this idea. It's a lot of information, and so give y'all some time to scan it over and digest it a little bit. And any questions? Anyone got their hand up? Carrie, any questions in the chat?
Nothing in the chat.
All right. So in that case, I've given just a tiny bit of homework to take a look at these gaps and needs, to be thinking about what you see and what you don't see. Like I said, tomorrow I'll go over them in depth, but there's so much, even if I read every one of them, it wouldn't be helpful. So I'm going to talk through some of these, but I expect that to be a little bit more of a discussion. So logistics for tomorrow, same link, same time. We will come in, we'll refresh a little bit of what we heard, what we did today. Then as we progress forward in the day, we're going to look back at these gaps and needs. If you see on your sheet, you even have a space to add extras. So as a group, if we find any more are necessary, we can add them. If you want to take any of these off, I love crossing things off lists. So that would be great too. And then we're going to vote. You'll get to prioritize what you think this network should really be focusing on in detail over the next couple of years. And then together we'll work out what those actions look like. And then we'll go on we do have some time set aside for some of those harder conversations. Maybe we have some time to talk about proactive policies, how we get those enacted. That came up last time. We can also talk about this challenge that was brought up around implementation. Maybe we have some time where we can talk about activating action at the state level. Any questions? If not, I think we can get out of here a little early, 8 whole minutes back. Any comments, anything else from the group before we break for the day?
And Renee, I have a comment or a suggestion. Yeah, so there's a great deal of very valuable information that the network has produced, in the context of a larger regional sense. And I've mentioned this before, maybe you should expand that to the Southeast Florida. So we have, because I know there are a lot of people in Southeast Florida doing vulnerability assessment. And I think this issue of people in the same, entity or institute not collaborating, it came up in those too. So that could be value in having a bigger network or exchange, at least some information through some mechanism like this. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, and maybe we can talk too. We have that time again tomorrow for tackling some of the more wicked problems, how this could be integrated more formally, maybe with the Gulf climate and community of practice. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Anything else from anybody else? All right. Y'all have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, 8:50 Central, 9:50 Eastern. Thanks again for your contributions. And thanks again, Carolyn, Cynthia, and Chase for some great content.
Thank you.
Thanks.